Hello and welcome back to Her Revenge Arc. My name is Alara, and tonight I want to tell you a story. It's a story about fathers and daughters, about love that feels like a transaction, and about the nature of inheritance. We often think of inheritance as a gift, a transfer of wealth from one generation to the next. We picture mansions, stocks, priceless art. But sometimes the most significant thing we can be left with isn't a fortune. Sometimes it's a lesson. And sometimes that lesson is delivered in the cruelest, most brilliant way imaginable. This is the story of how my father died, leaving his entire empire to his beautiful young new wife, and how she, in her moment of ultimate triumph, discovered that the greatest fortune in the city was in fact the greatest debt. It is a story of a trap laid with meticulous, posthumous care. A story of a queen sacrificed to win the game. And I was the one left to watch it all unfold. So settle in and let me tell you how it began. My father, Richard Croft, was not a man built for warmth. He was constructed from granite, ambition, and the quiet, humming power of old money that had been aggressively multiplied by new money ruthlessness. He was a titan of finance, a name whispered in boardrooms with a mixture of fear and reverence. Our home, a sprawling stone mansion we called Blackwood Manor, was less a home and more a museum dedicated to his success. The air inside didn't smell of baking bread or fresh laundry. It smelled of lemon oil on polished mahogany, old leather-bound books that were never read, and the faint metallic scent of the stock market ticker that hummed incessantly from his study. Our relationship was much like the house itself. Grand, impressive from the outside, but cold and mostly empty on the inside. I was his daughter, his only child, the product of his first and only marriage to my mother, a woman who had wilted under the constant pressure of his world long before she passed away. To him, I was a component of his legacy, another asset to be managed. He ensured I had the best education, the finest clothes, a future that was on paper flawless. But affection was a currency he did not trade in. Our conversations were briefs, our dinners were negotiations, our moments together felt like scheduled appointments. I learned early on that to survive in his orbit was to be observant, quiet, and self-sufficient. I became a ghost in my own home, a silent witness to the empire he was building. I was 24, finishing my master's degree in art history, a field my father found laughably impractical when Serena floated into our lives. She was everything I was not. Where I was quiet, she was effervescent. Where I was reserved, she was dazzlingly expressive. She was 28. A former gallery curator with a smile that could disarm armies and eyes that seemed to hold a galaxy of admiration just for my father. She was beautiful in a way that felt both timeless and predatory. She moved with a liquid grace, her laughter echoing through the cavernous halls of Blackwood Manor, filling the silence I had grown so accustomed to. My father, a man who had never been swayed by sentiment, was utterly captivated, or so it seemed. He, who had always viewed emotion as a liability, began to perform the part of a man in love. He bought her jewels that dripped from her neck like crystallized water. He whisked her away on trips to Monaco and Milan. He paraded her at charity galas, his hand possessively on the small of her back, a proud smile on his face that I had never seen directed at me. Serena, for her part, played the role of the adoring partner to perfection. She would gaze at him during dinner parties, her chin resting in her hand, as if every word he spoke about corporate acquisitions was the most fascinating poetry. She learned his habits, catered to his ego, and seamlessly inserted herself into the fabric of his life until it was impossible to imagine it without her. To me, she was condescendingly sweet. She called me darling and sweetheart, in a tone that suggested I was a child to be placated. "Oh, Alara, darling," she'd say, touching my arm with perfectly manicured fingers, a massive diamond winking on one of them. "Art history. How quaint. It must be so wonderful to have a hobby. Richard is so generous to support your passions." She saw me as a harmless, slightly pathetic footnote in the grand story of her new life, an unbusinesslike daughter who posed no threat. She never looked at me long enough to see the observer behind my quiet eyes. She didn't realize that in a house built on calculation, I had learned to do the math. I watched her not with jealousy, but with a cold academic curiosity. I saw the way her eyes would flicker over a painting, not with appreciation for its beauty, but with a quick mental appraisal of its market value. I saw the fleeting look of boredom that crossed her face when my father would lapse into a story about his early, less glamorous years. She wasn't in love with the man. She was in love with his signature on a check. My father, I believed, was simply blind to it. A man of his staggering intelligence, duped by a pretty face and a convincing performance. It was the only explanation I had, and it filled me with a strange, bitter pity for him. Their wedding was an affair spoken about for months. It was held on the great lawn of Blackwood Manor, under a sea of white roses and twinkling lights. Serena was a vision in a designer gown that cost more than my first apartment. She glided down the aisle towards my father, her eyes shining with what the society pages would later call pure love. I, the dutiful daughter, stood by and watched, a silent ghost at the feast. During the reception, she found me standing by the French doors, looking out at the celebration. "Isn't it all just a dream, Ilara?" she sighed, sipping her champagne. She was already Mrs. Croft, and the title fit her like a second skin. "It's certainly a spectacle," I replied, my voice neutral. She gave a little laugh, a tinkling sound that was as practiced as her smile. "Your father, he's just the most incredible man. He's given me everything I could ever want." She glanced around the estate, her eyes sweeping over the guests, the decorations, the house itself. It wasn't a glance of sentiment. It was a glance of ownership. "And to think," she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "some people marry for love. How unambitious." She winked at me as if we were sharing a secret. In her mind, she had won the ultimate prize. She had conquered Richard Croft and his kingdom. She saw me not as a stepdaughter, but as a relic of a former life, soon to be put in storage. I simply nodded and let her believe it. What else could I do? I was just the quiet, impractical daughter, the harmless art historian, a ghost in the halls of my own home. The year that followed their wedding was a whirlwind of ostentatious living. Serena's ambition wasn't just to be rich, it was to be seen as rich. She redecorated parts of the manor with a gaudy flair that made my skin crawl, replacing priceless antiques with flashy modern pieces that screamed of new money. She hosted parties where the champagne flowed like water, and the guest lists were meticulously curated to include only the most influential, the most famous, the most useful. My father seemed to indulge her every whim. He, who had once scrutinized every line item on a budget with the intensity of a hawk, now signed off on her extravagant spending without a second glance. I saw less and less of him. He was always in a meeting, on a call, or jetting off to some exotic location with his radiant new wife. On the rare occasions we did speak, he seemed distracted, tired. The granite-like certainty in his eyes had been replaced by something I couldn't quite decipher. A weariness, perhaps. I chalked it up to his age, and to the exhausting task of keeping Serena happy. Then, about 18 months after the wedding, my father fell ill. It began subtly. A cough he couldn't shake. A paleness to his skin that even the warm lights of the manor couldn't hide. At first he dismissed it as he dismissed all weaknesses. But soon, even he couldn't ignore the fatigue that clung to him like a shroud. The doctors were called in. They came and went in their expensive cars, their faces grim and professional. The whispers started. Cancer. Aggressive. Pancreatic. Serena's reaction was the masterclass in public devotion. She canceled her social engagements. She was a constant presence by his bedside, fluffing his pillows, holding his hand for the benefit of the nurses, her face a mask of worried sorrow. She spoke to reporters who gathered at our gates in a soft, trembling voice, telling them of her unwavering love and her hope for a miracle. But when she thought no one was watching, I saw the truth. I saw her in the hallway, on her phone with a wealth manager, her voice sharp and impatient as she discussed portfolio performance. I saw her studying architectural blueprints for a new summer home in the Hamptons, a place my father would surely never see. I saw the cold, hard calculation in her eyes as she looked at his wasting frame. She wasn't tending to a husband she loved. She was waiting for an investment to mature. My own attempts to connect with him were systematically blocked. "He's resting, Ilara," Serena would say. meeting me at the door to his suite with that infuriatingly sweet smile. The doctors say he needs absolute quiet. You understand, darling? I did understand. I understood she was isolating him, ensuring her position as the sole gatekeeper to his world, both now and in the future. But I fought back in my own quiet way. I would wait until the night nurse was on her break and slip into his room. He was often asleep or lost in a morphine haze, but sometimes I would find him lucid. His powerful frame was diminished, lost in the vastness of his bed, but his eyes were still sharp. In those moments, the weariness I had seen before was gone, replaced by an intensity that was almost frightening. During one of those late-night visits just a few weeks before the end, he was awake and surprisingly alert. The room was dark, save for the glow of medical equipment. "Ilara," he rasped, his voice a shadow of its former commanding tone. He gestured for me to come closer. I sat on the edge of his bed, my heart aching. This was the closest we had been, physically and emotionally, in years. "They think I'm a fool," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "She thinks I'm a fool." I didn't know what to say. "Father." He turned his head and looked directly at me. The force of his gaze was startling. "Pay attention," he said, each word an effort. "I taught you how to play chess when you were a child. Do you remember?" I nodded, confused. "Yes." What was the most important lesson? I thought back to the countless hours in his study, the heavy marble pieces, his patient yet demanding voice guiding my moves. "Protect the king," I said. It was the obvious answer. A faint dry smile touched his lips. "No. That's what amateurs think. The most important lesson is that sometimes you must sacrifice your queen to win the game." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "Everyone watches the queen. She's flashy, powerful. But the real victory is quiet. It's about the move no one sees coming." His eyes held mine for a long moment. It felt less like a conversation and more like a transfer of information. A coded message I was meant to decipher. "The king is not always the most powerful piece on the board, Ilara," he said, his voice fading into a whisper. "But it is the most important. Remember that." He closed his eyes then and drifted back into sleep. I sat there in the humming silence, the weight of his words settling over me. Sacrifice the queen. The move no one sees coming. It felt profound, but its meaning was a mystery, locked away behind the fog of his illness and my own grief. That was the last real conversation I ever had with him. 2 weeks later, Richard Croft, titan of industry, builder of empires, died. Serena's grief was, of course, spectacular. She wept for the cameras. She issued a statement praising his strength and genius. She wore black couture that was both somber and exquisitely tailored. She was the grieving widow, a tragic and beautiful figure. And she was about to become one of the wealthiest women in the world. The reading of the will was scheduled for a week after the funeral. It was to take place in the downtown offices of Alastair Finch, my father's lawyer for over 30 years. Finch was a man cut from the same cloth as my father, old school, impeccably dressed, and with eyes that revealed nothing. The day was gray and overcast, the sky the color of wet slate. It felt appropriate. I chose a simple dark blue dress, something my mother would have worn. It felt like a small act of rebellion, a refusal to participate in the theater of mourning that Serena had so expertly stage-managed. Serena naturally arrived looking like a starlet from a classic film. She wore a wide-brimmed black hat with the delicate veil, a tailored black suit that hugged her curves, and dark sunglasses that she didn't remove even when we were inside. She swept into Finch's waiting room, trailing a cloud of expensive funereal perfume, and nodded curtly at me, a flicker of pity in her eyes. The poor disinherited daughter. We were led into a conference room paneled in dark wood. A long polished table reflected the gloomy light from the large window overlooking the city. Alastair Finch sat at the head of the table, a single thick manila envelope before him. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. "We are gathered here today for the reading of the last will and testament of Richard Artemus Croft," he began, his voice a dry monotone. He went through the legal preamble, the words washing over me. I wasn't listening. I was watching Serena. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, the picture of quiet dignity. But I could see the slight tremor in her fingers, the tension in her jaw. This was it. The culmination of all her efforts. The coronation. Finch opened the envelope and pulled out the will. He put on a pair of reading glasses and began. He listed a few minor bequests. A donation to the city opera, a token sum to his longtime chauffeur. My stomach tightened. Then he came to the main event. As to the remainder of my estate, Finch read, his voice unwavering, both real and personal, tangible and intangible, of whatever nature and wherever situated, including all property I may acquire or become entitled to after the date of this will, I give, devise, and bequeath it all in its entirety to my beloved wife, Serena Croft. A small, sharp intake of breath came from Serena. It was the only sound she made. Finch continued. It is my express wish that my daughter, Elara Croft, who is in my heart and thoughts always, receive nothing from my estate, as I have full faith and confidence that she has the intelligence and the fortitude to make her own way in this world, a gift more valuable than any inheritance I could provide. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had expected it, prepared for it, but hearing it read aloud in that sterile room was a different kind of pain. It was a public disavowal. A final, cold dismissal. All eyes were on me. I could feel Finch's professional gaze, and worse, I could feel Serena's. I knew if I looked up, I would see triumph and pity warring in her veiled eyes. I did what I had been trained to do my whole life. I showed nothing. I kept my gaze fixed on my hands folded in my lap. I willed myself not to cry, not to give her the satisfaction. I focused on my father's last words to me. Sacrifice the queen. The move no one sees coming. It made no sense. This felt like the final move, and I was the piece that had been swept from the board. Finch finished reading the legal boilerplate and carefully folded the document. That concludes the reading, he said quietly. Serena stood up, a picture of grace. She walked over to me and placed a cool hand on my shoulder. Elara, she said, her voice thick with false sympathy. I am so sorry. I had no idea. If there is anything at all I can do. I finally looked up at her. Through the black veil I could see the glint in her eyes. It was pure, unadulterated victory. You've done quite enough, Serena, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I stood up, nodded once to Mr. Finch, and walked out of the room, my back straight, my head held high. I could feel her watching me go. The newly crowned queen surveying her conquered territory. The moment the elevator doors closed, I allowed myself to lean against the cool metal wall, the carefully constructed dam of my composure finally breaking. A single hot tear traced a path down my cheek. It wasn't a tear for the money. It was a tear for the finality of it all, for the public confirmation of what I had always suspected, that in my father's grand and calculated life, I was ultimately disposable. Or so I thought. The weeks that followed were a blur of public humiliation and private adjustment. The story was everywhere. Tycoon snubs daughter. Leaves billions to young bride. I was painted as a tragic figure, the cast-off child. Friends of my father, men and women I had known my entire life, would give me pitying looks at the few social functions I was still forced to attend. It was suffocating. Serena, meanwhile, was blossoming in her new role as the city's most glamorous and powerful widow. She was no longer just Mrs. Croft. She was the sole proprietor of the Croft Empire. And she wore her new power like a diamond necklace. Her first act was to formally request that I vacate my rooms at Blackwood Manor. The request came via a sterile email from her new assistant. I was given 2 weeks. I packed my belongings, me books, my mother's few remaining possessions, the clothes on my back, and moved into a small, modest apartment on the other side of town. The silence of my new life was deafening after the constant hum of the manor. From this new, distant vantage point, I watched Serena's reign begin. She hosted a lavish celebration of life. For my father, that was more like a coronation for herself. She sold off his beloved, classic Bentley and replaced it with a fleet of garish sports cars in shades of pearl and crimson. She began a ruthless restructuring of my father's company, firing loyal long-term employees who had been with him for decades and replacing them with her own circle of slick, ambitious sycophants. She was on the cover of magazines, profiled as a brilliant businesswoman shattering stereotypes. In interviews, she would always mention me with a sigh of practiced regret. Poor Lara. We're not in touch, sadly. I think the will was a great shock to her. I do hope she finds her footing. I wish her nothing but the best. I did nothing. I found a part-time job cataloging archives for a local university. I lived quietly. I read books. I grieved for my father not as the titan, but as the complicated, cold man who had shaped my life and then, it seemed, abandoned me at its end. I replayed his final words to me over and over in my head. Sacrifice the queen. The move no one sees coming. The phrase had become a meaningless mantra, a riddle without an answer. Then, about 2 months after the will reading, the first tremor occurred. It was small. Insignificant, really. I only heard about it through a friend who still worked in the lower echelons of Croft Industries. A major supplier, one who had worked with my father for 20 years, had suddenly, inexplicably, terminated their contract. It was a multi-million-dollar account. When Serena's new team demanded to know why, the supplier's CEO had simply replied, "A matter of principle." It caused a stir, a dip in the stock, but Serena, in a televised interview, dismissed it as a minor bump in the road during a period of bold transition. A week later, another tremor. A prestigious art journal published a scathing exposé on several paintings in the Croft collection, my father's prized assembly of Impressionist masterpieces. The article, written by a notoriously meticulous German academic, presented compelling evidence that 3 of the most valuable pieces of Monet, a Degas, and a Renoir were, in fact, incredibly high-quality forgeries. The art world was scandalized. The value of the collection, which Serena had been using as collateral for other ventures, was instantly cast into doubt. I started to feel a strange prickling sensation at the back of my neck. These were not random events. The supplier who pulled out. He was my father's oldest friend, the best man at his first wedding. The German academic who exposed the forgeries. My father had secretly funded his research for a decade. These were not attacks on Serena. They were too precise, too personal. They were moves on a chessboard. Moves my father had set in motion long ago. And then the real earthquake hit. It didn't come in the form of a dramatic announcement. It came in the form of a single cream-colored envelope, delivered by courier to Serena at Blackwood Manor. I heard the story later from a terrified housemaid Serena had fired in a fit of rage. The letter was from a private Swiss bank, an institution known for its discretion and its powerful clientele. The letter, polite and unyielding, was a formal call on a loan. A massive loan personally guaranteed by Richard Croft, with his entire estate listed as security. The due date for the first multi-million-dollar interest payment was in 1 week. Serena, according to the maid, had laughed it off. She called it a clerical error, a ridiculous mistake. She got on the phone with her team of high-priced lawyers and financial advisors, the one she had hired to replace my father's old guard. She demanded they fix it. But there was nothing to fix. The loan was real. The signature was my father's. The guarantee was ironclad. Suddenly, Serena's endless river of cash began to dry up. When her advisors tried to liquidate stocks to cover the payment, they found the bulk of my father's portfolio was tied up in high-risk, long-term derivatives that couldn't be touched without incurring catastrophic losses. When they tried to get a line of credit against the company, they found the company itself was leveraged to the hilt, burdened by debts my father had apparently taken on in his final year, funding ambitious, failed projects in emerging markets. Panic began to set in. Serena tried to sell one of the lesser paintings from the collection to generate quick cash. But with the forgery scandal still raging, no reputable auction house would touch it. The art collection, once a symbol of her limitless wealth, was now a tainted and illiquid asset. Her next move was to try and mortgage Blackwood Manor. It was then that she made a truly horrifying discovery. The manor was already mortgaged, not once but 3 times over, to 3 different international lenders. My father had, in the last year of his life, systematically and secretly borrowed against every single major asset he owned. He hadn't been a fool blinded by love. He had been a saboteur. He had spent his final year not indulging his new wife, but building her a gilded cage. He had taken the magnificent edifice of his fortune and hollowed it out from the inside, leaving behind a beautiful, glittering, but structurally worthless facade. He had racked up hundreds of millions of dollars in carefully hidden, legally airtight debt, all of it personally guaranteed, all of it tied directly to the estate he was about to bequeath. And he had left it all to Serena. The final, devastating scene of the play took place back in Alistair Finch's conference room. Serena had demanded the meeting, her voice, I was told, a hysterical shriek over the phone. She was convinced there was a conspiracy, that Finch and I were somehow behind this. She was going to sue. She was going to destroy us. She arrived at the meeting not in a chauffeured limousine, but in a taxi. She was no longer the serene, veiled widow. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes wild with panic and fury. She was a queen who had just realized her throne was made of cardboard. I was there. Finch had called and asked me to attend. I believe your father would have wanted you to be present, was all he said. I sat in the same chair as before, a quiet observer. This is a joke. A fraud. Serena screamed as soon as she burst into the room, throwing a stack of papers onto the polished table. They were letters from creditors, banks, lenders from all over the world. Richard would never do this. He loved me. You, she spun and pointed a trembling finger at me. You did this. You and your senile old lawyer cooked this up to steal my inheritance. Finch didn't flinch. He calmly gestured to the chair opposite him. Please sit down, Mrs. Croft. I will not sit down. I want answers. Very well, Finch said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. He opened a thick leather-bound file that I hadn't seen before. Let me provide you with some answers. What you have inherited, Mrs. Croft, is indeed the entirety of the Richard Croft estate. As per the will, you are the sole legal heir to all of its assets. He paused, looking at her over the rim of his glasses, and all of its liabilities. He then proceeded, with methodical, brutal precision, to lay out the full extent of the financial ruin. He spoke of the Swiss bank loan, the leveraged corporate assets, the triple mortgaged manor, the lines of credit taken out against the now worthless art. He had a document for everything, each one bearing my father's unmistakable, bold signature. With every word Finch spoke, the color drained further from Serena's face. The rage was replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. She sank into a chair, her body seeming to deflate. Why? She whispered, her voice cracking. Why would he do this? Finch closed the file. He looked at her, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than professional detachment in his eyes. It was a cold, quiet satisfaction. My client, Mr. Croft, he said, was a man who valued many things: intelligence, loyalty, legacy. He was also a man who despised being underestimated. He believed that true wealth was not something to be acquired through marriage, but something to be earned through merit. He constructed a test, you might say, a test to see if his chosen heir had the acumen to manage his empire. He let the words hang in the air. You inherited the throne, Mrs. Croft. It is simply a shame you never thought to check if it was solvent. Serena just stared at him, her mouth slightly agape. The full, crushing weight of the truth had finally landed. She hadn't won a kingdom. She had inherited a prison of debt. A debt so colossal, so all-encompassing, that she would spend the rest of her life trying to escape it. Every asset she had flaunted, the house, the cars, the jewels she thought were hers, would be seized and liquidated, and it still wouldn't be enough to cover the deficit. She was, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt. And her. Serena finally choked out, gesturing weakly towards me. What about her? She gets away with everything. Finch looked at me and then back at Serena. Miss Croft was explicitly disinherited, he said simply. She has no legal claim to the estate, and therefore, she has no legal responsibility for its debts. She is, as your lawyers will confirm, entirely untouched by this matter. And in that moment I finally understood. The public humiliation, the disinheritance, the pain of being cast aside hadn't been a punishment. It had been my protection. My father hadn't thrown me out of the kingdom. He had pushed me out of the way of a collapsing building. By giving me nothing, he had given me everything. He had given me freedom. Serena let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. A sound of pure, unadulterated despair. The beautiful, triumphant queen was gone. In her place was just a woman, trapped and broken, who had made the fatal error of misjudging her king. The fallout was swift and merciless. The media, which had once celebrated Serena, turned on her with savage glee. The headlines were brutal. The billion-dollar bride is broke. Gold digger inherits mountain of debt. Inside Richard Croft's ultimate revenge. Bailiffs became a permanent fixture at the gates of Blackwood Manor. Everything was catalogued and seized. The flashy sports cars were towed away. The designer furniture was loaded onto trucks. The couture gowns and diamond necklaces were inventoried as assets to be liquidated. Serena was forced to move out, hounded by paparazzi who captured her haggard, tear-streaked face for the world to see. She was a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered at the very same cocktail parties where she had once reigned supreme. I watched it all from a distance, from the quiet sanctuary of my small apartment. I felt no joy, no triumphant glee. I only felt a profound sense of closure, a grim finality. The game was over. But there was one piece of the puzzle left. My father's last words to me. The king is not always the most powerful piece on the board, but it is the most important. And his cryptic comment about my intelligence and fortitude being my true inheritance. It felt like there was still one more move he expected me to make. I thought back to our chess games in his study, to the board itself. It was an old, ornate thing he'd inherited from his own father. After the contents of the house were seized but before they were sent to auction, I called Alastair Finch. I asked him if it would be possible to retrieve one item from the estate for sentimental reasons. An old worthless chessboard. Given the circumstances, and the fact that its monetary value was negligible compared to the mountain of debt, the request was granted. The board was delivered to my apartment. It felt strange to see it there, a relic from a different world. I ran my hands over the familiar polished wood and inlaid ivory. I thought about his words. Sacrifice the queen, the move no one sees coming. On instinct, I picked up one of the pieces. The king. It felt slightly heavier than I remembered. I shook it. A faint rattle from within. My heart began to beat faster. With a small knife from my kitchen, I carefully worked at the felt base of the piece. It came loose, revealing a hollowed-out cavity. Inside was not a jewel or a secret message. It was a single small old-fashioned key. I knew instantly what it was for. My father had kept a private safe deposit box at a small independent bank in the city's old financial district. It was the bank he'd used before he became a titan, a place no one would think to look. He had told me once years ago that it was where he kept sentimental things. The next morning I went to the bank. My hand trembled as I handed the key and my identification to the clerk. I was led into a vault, all steel and silence. The clerk slid out a long, thin metal box and left me alone in a private viewing room. I took a deep breath and opened it. It wasn't filled with gold bars or bearer bonds. It was better. It was a series of documents, deeds, patents, and a single handwritten letter. The deeds were for a handful of small, unassuming commercial properties in up-and-coming neighborhoods, purchased decades ago under a shell corporation completely disconnected from the Croft empire. Properties my father had bought as a young man, long before he met Serena, long before he became a household name. Their value over the years had quietly compounded into a small, but very significant fortune. Clean, unencumbered, and completely invisible. The patents were for a series of financial software algorithms he had developed in his early days, technologies that were now the backbone of many modern trading platforms. He had never sold them. He had simply held them, their licensing rights now worth a fortune of their own. And then there was the letter. It was written in his familiar, sharp handwriting. Alara, if you are reading this, it means you were clever enough to solve the final puzzle. I am proud of you. What I have done to Serena may seem cruel. It is. But she and others like her see people as objects and life as a transaction. I paid her for her time and her performance with a lesson in the true nature of value. a lesson she will never forget. But this was never about her. It was about you. I could have left you my fortune, and you would have been rich. But you would have been soft. The world is full of Serenas, and I could not protect you from all of them. So I chose to arm you instead. I forced you to stand on your own, to endure public scorn, to rely on your own intelligence. I gave you the hardship that forges strength. That was my true gift. This is your inheritance. Not the Croft Empire, which was a noisy, burdensome thing. But this, a clean foundation. It is not my legacy. It is your beginning. Build your own castle. Make your own name. Be smarter than I was. Be happier than I was. Your father, Richard. I folded the letter, my eyes blurring with tears. Not tears of sadness or pain, but of a sudden, overwhelming understanding. He hadn't been a cold, distant father. He had been a teacher in his own brutal, complicated, and calculated way. The entire saga, the marriage, the illness, the will, had been his final, most elaborate lesson. He sacrificed his queen to checkmate a predator, but the entire purpose of the game was to make sure his most important piece, his king, his legacy, his daughter, was safe, strong, and free. He hadn't left me an inheritance of wealth. He had left me an inheritance of wisdom. He had left me a revenge arc that wasn't even my own. But in surviving it, I had found my true self. And that was a fortune no one could ever take away. So that is my story. The story of how I lost a kingdom and gained the world. It taught me that the most valuable things in life are often the ones that are unseen. The ones you must be clever enough to find for yourself. And it makes me wonder, what is the most valuable lesson someone has ever taught you? Perhaps in the most unexpected or even painful way. What is the true inheritance they left you with? Let me know your story in the comments below. And if you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video, sharing it with someone who might appreciate it, and subscribing to her revenge arc for more stories of justice served and lessons learned. Until next time.